Hello, everyone, and welcome to AshaUSA's monthly speaker series on the topic of Take Charge of Your Life. Since May is Mental Health Month, this month we are going to talk about teen mental health matters, lessons from the pandemic. Do you know that a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health was declared in October 2021? US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued an urgent advisory last December for significant public health challenges that need the nation's immediate awareness and action. Let's see what he has to say. Just a minute here.
For a year or 6 months?
Well, Kevin, first of all, this is a critical issue, and I appreciate you drawing attention to it. Youth mental health matters not just because it's gotten tougher for a lot of kids during the pandemic. That is a really important reason, and we know depression and anxiety have increased for many children during this pandemic. But the truth is that our kids were struggling before the pandemic as well. Rates of suicide had increased by more than 50% in the decade or so preceding the pandemic. We'd also seen a 44% increase in the percentage of high school students who were saying that they felt persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness in the decade prior to the pandemic. So our kids were struggling before. The pandemic has made it worse for some kids, especially those 140,000 plus young people who lost a caregiver to COVID-19. And there are a couple of challenges that we've got to meet and meet as quickly as we can. One of them is exactly what you mentioned, the gap in treatment. And the reason that people are having difficulty accessing treatment comes from several sources. One, we don't have enough mental health care providers. We need more. The second is, despite in 2008 passing the Mental Health Parity Law and Addiction Equity Act, which was supposed to bring reimbursements for mental health care services into parity with other traditional health services, that is not being adequately enforced in many parts of the country. And so you're finding that reimbursements are still too low. But we're also, Kevin, not using technology well enough to bring mental health services to rural areas, even to urban areas which may not have the number of providers that they actually need. Technology can be a boon, as we actually saw that during the pandemic, but we've got to make sure that we close the gaps in broadband access and bring these services to people where they are. So I feel a great sense of urgency around this. I'm a dad, first and foremost. I've got two small kids who are 4 and 5. Thankfully, they are well now, but I want to know as a father and as a doctor, as a surgeon general, that if any child in our country needs help, we have the help available for them. And that is just not true everywhere right now.
What do we need to do as a nation to greater incentivize people to get into this field? Because the people that we're talking to say, you can spend all the money you want, but there are not enough people to help these children. The wait lists just continue to grow.
Well, I think we have to think creatively and broadly about the workforce. So when we think about mental health care, we tend to think about psychiatrists, who are an important part of the mental health care workforce, but they are one component of the workforce. And we recognize it takes years to train somebody to be a psychiatrist. And we need more psychiatrists for sure. But we also need more therapists and more psychologists. We need more counselors in schools, where the ratio of school counselors to children is imbalanced, and we need to correct that. We also need to think about peers. We know that peer support groups can be extraordinarily helpful in helping provide some additional support to children, especially when they're struggling. That doesn't mean peer support is a substitute for medical help, but to really get kids the support that they need, broadly speaking, you need a spectrum of support, and peer support groups can be a critical part of that. And finally, community members, family members and other community members, including teachers, can be important resources here as well. Some communities have taken it upon themselves to train individuals in mental health first aid to be able to serve as a front line, if you will, for getting people help and then connecting them to resources in their community. These are all the different ways in which we can think about building a mental health force, if you will, of individuals across the spectrum who can help people who might be struggling. And finally, just keep in mind the technology piece matters here too, because we know that one of the challenges is making sure that somebody has access to a provider, but they may not be a provider in their community, but they can use technology to have a session or consultation with somebody who might be hundreds or thousands of miles away, but can be present, can provide them with the care that they need virtually. That can be a huge value add. We do that in some parts of the country very successfully. We just need to expand that kind of technology outreach.
I mean, if a child has to wait 6 months to a year to get help, is that acceptable?
No, it's not. It's not acceptable. Our children should be able to get help much sooner than that. If you look at the data also, you recognize that kids often have to wait 11 years on average from the onset of their symptoms to ultimately getting a diagnosis and then being on the way to get the help they need. That's 11 long, painful years during which a child suffers. And by extension, their families worry about them and the families suffer too. No parent should ever have to go through that. No child should ever have to suffer for that amount of time. That's why I issued a Surgeon General's advisory on youth mental health in December of last year, because we can't wait for the pandemic to end to start thinking about how to address youth mental health issues. Our kids have been struggling for too long. We've got to step up and do everything we can inside and outside government to make sure they have the help they need.
There was a white paper here that was written that basically said the behavioral health workforce is at a breaking point. Is it a national emergency or is it at a breaking point? How would you describe it?
I do think that the behavioral health workforce is strained and under great duress across the country. And some of that is because of pre-pandemic issues, where we didn't have enough providers, we had insufficient reimbursement, we had systems which did not integrate primary care and traditional care with behavioral health care, which made it harder for providers and for patients. But the pandemic has made this even more challenging for many providers and for their patients. And we're seeing that as people struggle and burn out in the healthcare workforce, not just in the behavioral health community, but in the broader healthcare workforce, that people are starting to drop out of the workforce due to depression, anxiety, and a sense of PTSD, honestly, after everything our healthcare workers have gone through during the pandemic. What I worry people may not fully understand is the implications for us even after the pandemic. If people leave an already thin workforce, then we're not going to be able to get the help that we need for ourselves, for our families, for our kids, most importantly, and that it will compound an already very difficult situation.
I'm sure you've had many discussions with the president about this. Is there anything in the horizon that the president can do to greater incentivize people to get into the profession, to do loan forgiveness, to pay for training, to pay for internships, to help states, sort of prop them up, to give them some help?
Yeah, so this is an issue that's very important to the president. He and I have talked about it in the past, and I'll certainly tell you that he has not wasted time, certainly, in making sure that.
Sorry about that. But we really needed to what the Surgeon General had to say before we start our topic today. So the pandemic, as he said, added to the pre-existing challenges that America's youth faced. It disrupted the lives of children and adolescents, such as in-person schooling, in-person social engagements with peers, with teachers, access to healthcare, to food, housing, and in general health of their own parents and caregivers. So with such a strong warning, we definitely feel the need to educate ourselves more and become aware of the mental health issues our teens are facing and how we can help them. So to address this topic, we have with us today a licensed psychologist, Saraswati Bhadri. She goes by Saras. Hello, Saras, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Sayali, for inviting me. And thank you so much for addressing this such an important topic, which is so much relevant right now than any other times. And it was wonderful to watch Surgeon General's, his warning and his stats on how important and how significant this issue is especially right now, what we're facing. I mean, even as he said, I'm not going to repeat what he said. Pre-pandemic, we were failing to take care of our teens, and now it's been, the pandemic and other things have confounded this and made it even more challenging.
Yeah, and let me introduce your background a little bit. So Saras has a doctorate degree in clinical psychology from Minnesota School of Professional Psychology, and currently she works full-time at University of St. Thomas. Anxiety, depression, trauma, cultural adjustment, low self-esteem, OCD, and transitional distress are some of the challenging areas that Saras works in and helps people overcome. Her therapeutic approaches include client-centered, emotion-focused, and mindfulness-based skills. She also integrates yoga and meditation when working with clients. So I'm really happy that you are here with us today, and we would love to talk to you. And as our Surgeon General said, we are right now experiencing a paucity of practitioners in this field. So I really want to thank you for doing the work that you do. And I would like to start by asking, what kind of issues have you seen in your students, especially what have they been struggling during the COVID pandemic?
Yes, thank you for such a wonderful introduction, Sally. So I have been seeing, there's a range of issues, rates of depression, anxiety, transitional issues, first years, they're coming, they didn't have their high school graduation, and then they're coming to the first year for college, and they don't, they have been home for 2 years and transitioning to college. And now it becomes a challenge for them. Like, how do I relate to, I'm not with my parents, I'm not in my safe place. And now not just academic issue, relational issue, managing roommates, and all of these things are, just sort of adding to their stress, and they're overwhelmed. So I would say, there's a range of things that I'm seeing. And I would say anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation are some of the top ones. We haven't evaluated our data for this year, but it'll be interesting. End of the year is coming to see. But in terms of my practice and what I see, these are some of the top ones.
Yeah, and you work especially with young college students, right? Teens and young adults. And although it's normal for any child or a young person to experience temporary change in emotions and behaviors, it becomes important to recognize when some of these are warning signs of distress so that they can get help. So what would you tell them, as well as their parents and caregivers, as to what are some of the warning signs to look for?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really wonderful question. And before I address that question, because I think what we're dealing with a different time right now. Many experts, so I will get into that question, but there's a contextual piece that is important to understand, because the more we understand, the more we will be able to help our kids, these teens and adolescents, accurately. So what I want to address is, understanding what we're going through. Many experts in the field are saying that we're going through, it's called collective trauma. So collective trauma as a whole, not even a nation, the whole world is going through this collective trauma when a society or something that happens that we're not ready for, it's unpredictable, we don't know when it's going to end. And some of the examples are wars, pandemic, natural disasters are just some of the examples. And, right now what we see, these four major things like we're dealing with for last 2-3 years, pandemic, and it doesn't, we can't say, oh, it's getting better, but it hasn't stopped. Racial injustice is an issue, especially in Minnesota, what happened with George Floyd, that whole thing impacts not just teens, everybody's mental health. Economic inflation, there's a war in Ukraine. So I think these are some contextual factors to understand that as a world right now, we're dealing with this trauma, and it has a domino effect that, parents, teachers, other professionals, other adults in these teens are struggling already. So when we're talking about, this specific 12 to 18, or even like 21, what we are seeing here, it's a really important age. And at this age, you try to figure out your identity, your brain is pruning, you're trying to solidify, like, oh, what's going on, who am I? And in order for the teens to do all of this work, they need this safe presence. They need to be able to feel safe. And right now the world doesn't feel like a safe place. So I think it's important to understand that it's globally what is trickling down in all different directions. So in terms of some of the signs that you may see in your teens, irritability, if your teens or even like adults, like 21, 22, they are not being themselves. Like, for example, they're just short, they're irritated, they're just not being themselves, like they're not taking care of their personal hygiene. They seem a little bit distant. They seem like, there's not that same connection you had, or they're talking about like some things like in a bigger level. Oh, what's the point of life? Life is not safe anyways. You want to make sure that you get them right help. Actually sit down, have a conversation with them. And sometimes sitting down can be too intimidating. So maybe, developing some sort of like going for a walk, playing board games, so you develop that bonding with them. And more important than that, know that if you're not doing well and you talk to your teens that, oh, it's okay, things will be okay, they know more than what we realize that they know. So it's just being mindful of that. We need to feel comfortable about talking our own mental health. If we need help, we go and seek help. So we're modeling the behavior. And at this age, what we say is not important. What we model, that is more important.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And you rightly described that how the world is spinning out of control right now. That's the feeling we all get.
Mhm.
And the importance of making sure that we understand that we have to deal with our own mental health and also make sure that our kids are okay. So, when it comes to seeking help, generally people have a lot of stereotypes, right? Especially if, let's say even if they realize that their child has a problem and they go to a doctor, and if there's a need for some sort of medical treatment, prescription medications or therapy, but people still are hesitant about doing all that. So can you talk a little bit about that and the importance of therapy and how it works, and how can they find the care that they need?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. I think, it's, so, if you look at this question, I think, again, like, as I said, I'm going to repeat that, you feeling comfortable with you reading more about it, you sort of like educating yourself, like, what is this? So for example, if I have a flu or I have, some health issue like diabetes, I'm going to go to my doctor. Same thing, if I'm emotionally not feeling well, if I'm feeling down, it's okay to go to see a therapist, or it's okay to see a psychiatrist just to get some medications. But I can see that there's a lot of stigma, especially in the South Asian community, that you can deal with your problem, talk to your adults and you'll be just fine. But know that we're in a different time. We're living in America. Things are different. It's not the same that it was in India. So, the way therapy works, you come in, and again, like, it depends on there's more than hundreds of different kinds of therapy. And I think, like, so finding a therapist is like finding a good dress that looks good on you and it's a good fit. So making sure that you have a chemistry that with that person, you feel safe, they understand about your culture, they are sensitive to that. So those are some important pieces. And I think your organization, Sally, is doing a wonderful job putting that resources together for people to find that right connection and right match. So what we do, like, in terms of, I'll just talk about my experience when I have a student coming in the first session, I take a global history, what's happening, which is their current symptoms, how long the symptoms have been going on, do they have medical condition that might be increasing some of the mental health symptoms. We talk about family. How is the family dynamic? What's happening in the family? All of those pieces. And then we talk about what are your goals? What do you want to work on? And then once we both sort of come up with goals collaboratively, because it's not my goals. I want to make sure that they are clear that this is what we're working on. And then, we might teach them some skills. We might process some things. For example, right now, what's going on with the whole COVID-19 pandemic and war in Ukraine, or these economic in fluctuation, there's things are happening. So they might see, I hear from my students, I don't know, I'm just so scared. I feel so anxious for no reason. And then we give the context of their anxiety. No, you're not crazy. There's a reason. There's absolutely everybody's feeling this way. And how do we make sure that validating those experiences and teaching them skills like, okay, yes, I'm scared too, makes sense, but how do we go and do our classes? How do we go and hang out with our friends? So like teaching those skills. So we can't just delete the anxiety or delete the depression, but we can minimize it so it's functional.
Yeah, that's very important. I think that word functional is very important because many times a student or a person might seem to be doing fine. In fact, there are some high functioning individuals who are like excelling in their academics, doing well in all activities, but inside they're struggling. And you mentioned suicidal ideation, and in the past few years, there has been increase in suicide rates among high school students or young college students of South Asian origin for this particular reason, that they are high functioning. So the parents or people around them are not able to find out that they're really struggling with some sort of mental health issue. Is there anything else you would tell the parents especially? Because as you know, in our culture, there's a lot of academic pressure that is put on students. And generally the rhetoric is that, oh, you have all the resources, we are giving you everything. What is there to complain about? Just make sure you get good night's sleep or go hang out with your friends and you'll be fine. There's nothing like depression and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about that cultural piece?
Oh, absolutely. So yes, that's huge when we know that, I'm immigrant in this country and I'm raising my kids here. So, that sort of that bicultural identity and how do they develop their identity in this culture? And so parents are trying to, I think, especially my observation, especially with South Asian, like my observation with Indian folks I hang around with, there's a lot of like, oh, this black and white mentality. India is better. And, in America, there's a sort of like, painting these pictures, one is better than others. And the reality is like, our kids have to live in this culture. They have to function in this culture. They have to work with white peers. They have to work. So how do we give them skills to live in this culture, thrive in this culture? So kind of, I think, really understanding that this black and white mentality, it's not very helpful for their teens, even though, and I hear that, it's coming from a very good place because there's a longing, there's yearning for, I want to make sure that my kids don't lose our culture. We want to make sure that they don't lose that identity piece, their Indian identity piece, which is important. And how do we teach them to hold that identity and their American identity both at the same time? How do we have a conversation with them that, okay, you know what, like in terms of like, how do we talk to your white peers about your culture? How do we, so first of all, like, how do we be comfortable with that Indian identity and American identity? So there's a lot of research in terms of the identity development. And one of the things that a lot of these researchers have found, that if a person can accept both identities and learn to fluctuate fluidly with both identities, their mental health is much better, their stress level is much lower. So keeping that in mind, that, so for example, let's say, they're hanging out with, I don't know, a white friend, but they are like, they come to, they're like, I'm not sure, how do we talk about Christmas, or how do we talk about Thanksgiving? You sit down with them and educate them about, even like, let's say they're talking about like, who's Jesus? My friend was talking about Jesus. Oh, okay, let's read a book about Jesus. Let's understand that. Or, let's learn about Thanksgiving. Let's learn about Christmas, so they can feel comfortable talking to their friends about it. So I think, some of those pieces, and I know that for parents, it can be challenging because we are busy, we have so many things going on, but I think just being mindful of, how this is our responsibility. This was our choice to have our kids to here. So we can't expect them to be Indian in this culture. They're not in India. So I think opening ourselves to this greater world, opening ourselves to this, the world we're living in, accepting both pieces and teaching our kids too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it brings back to the concept that parents themselves have to open up their world and learn more about the world that their child is growing up in. One more thing that research has shown, and we have seen in the community, is that generally when it comes to mental health matters, we see that kids or even teens and youth, they tend to show psychosomatic symptoms, right? Like they might say, oh, they have a headache or stomach ache, or they're not eating. And parents think, oh, there's something wrong with their body, and they take them to the doctor. So how can you tell what are some of the things to look for when kids are complaining? And how can that be related to a mental illness or a mental health issue rather than a physical health issue?
Really good question. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, actually in our community, we see a lot of ER visits or doctors visit more than, taking them to the therapist or psychiatrist. So I think, once something it's a pattern, for example, that like, your kids, let's one of the example is like, they have to go to school, and every time maybe there's a group project in school and they're like, my tummy hurts or I'm having a headache. And there's a sort of like some sort of a consistent pattern that they're scared, but they don't know how to say like, I'm anxious and scared. So they might feel more comfortable, and they know that you'll be more acceptable if they say like, I have a headache or I have a tummy ache. So seeing those patterns, seeing changes in their mood, like, there's kind of, or mood and isolation. Like if they're like, I don't want to hang out with my friends, I don't want to eat dinner with you, like that's isolation, disconnection piece, what I talked about earlier. So mood changes, you see kind of in terms of even their appetite and their eating behavior, like, maybe they're restricting, or maybe they're not eating as much, like that, those changes in appetites, irritability, like, they're just short with you. They're not, even you ask simple things and they're just cold and short with you. Sleep, they're not sleeping well. They're up in their computer like until 2 or 3 o'clock. They're just not able to sleep. So some of those symptoms, and then again, that consistency, and if in certain places they go and they have these somatic symptoms, then, take them to the doctor. I think that's the first step. You want to rule out any physiological issues. But if you know that, it's more than that. If you have that gut sense, trust your intuition, and maybe it's taking them to the doctor, and in addition to that, taking them to a therapist, to just see, making sure that they're not kind of developing that early sign of anxiety or depression, or maybe OCD, or what that might be.
Yeah, those are very important pointers. Saras, thank you so much for the work you do and for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us. And as you just pointed out, mental health is not just the absence of mental disorder. It is a state of well-being in which one realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and work productively and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So just functioning as a well-adjusted individual is a sign of good mental health. And Saras, would you like to share some resources or tell parents as to where they can go when they see the first signs of distress?
Absolutely. So I think, depending on which grade your kid is, sometimes schools, they have their own counselors. You can get the resources from that. Psychology Today is a really wonderful database. So if you go and type, let's say if you're living in St. Paul, you can just type St. Paul and you look at culturally sensitive therapist. It might just pop, or Indian therapist. It might pop up those resources. It also lists all the insurances that you might have. So it'll give you sort of like these practitioner and providers, if they take your insurance or not. So that I think that those are some good steps to take. And I think, your website, I looked at it, and, some of the resources getting from looking at those resources. And I think just honestly, I think Psychology Today, I would say Psychology Today is a really wonderful, because people are living, it really gives that geographically, it's really well laid out. So it can, and geographically, and it has so many criteria that you can choose and pick and choose those kinds of things. National hotline, crisis line that you can, if you Google it for each area, there's different hotlines. So look for those. Those are the first step.
Yeah.
And if you can't think of anything, I would say go to your doctor, and they might be able to give you specific resources.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And also National Alliance on Mental Illnesses, NAMI, has local chapters everywhere. So NAMI Minnesota, you can go to their website. They have crisis line as well as a lot of resources. And as you mentioned, our AshaUSA website, www.ashausa.org, we have compiled a list of resources, especially mental health providers of South Asian origin in Minnesota. So please feel free to visit our website. And again, thank you so much for watching this session. Please join us again next month for another session on the topic of take charge of your life. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.